We are going to, this is the fourth time I have started this, so I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. This is Chapter 14, A New Birth of Freedom. It covers the years during the Civil War. This is General McClellan working with his troops. He is very much known for working with his troops. That's kind of one of the only things that he did do. But he was a very good recruiter of men, and his men were very loyal to him. These are the topics that we're going to cover in this particular chapter. In this particular lecture, we are only going to be covering the first 2 points. I was going to say if you're okay with that, but you have to be. I'm the one running the show. Okay, so our focus question for this particular bit: why is the Civil War considered the first modern war? And if this was class, I would say, can anyone tell me why? But considering when we had this in class, I recorded an hour and 15 minutes worth of silence, we are not doing that. So our two sides. This is really the first time we have armies, like large armies, fighting with weapons made by the Industrial Revolution. The amount of casualties that we have in this war are unprecedented. Keep in mind that a casualty in military speak can mean either someone who dies or someone who is injured. It's basically if you are out of commission to fight again. So we have unprecedented casualties in this particular war, but I would also like to point out the reason why that is yes, the technology, but also the only people fighting in this war are Americans. So yes, you're gonna have more people die. Like that's just how that works. That is simple math, and that is math even I can do, and you all have seen my limits. This particular war depended on the effectiveness of our political leaders, and the Union and the rest of this country was actually, in my opinion, very lucky that someone like Abraham Lincoln was at the helm rather than someone else. Now, Jefferson Davis didn't necessarily do poorly with what he had. He just did not have as much as the Union did. Even at the beginning, the ability of our leaders to mobilize the economic resources at their disposal and the citizens that are supporting the war effort, all of this is very integral to fighting a war successfully. The Union seemed to be favored over the Confederacy. Our North, that included our border states, had a population of about 22 million, and the states that are in rebellion only included about 9 million, with 3.5 million of those being enslaved individuals. So, and we're not going to arm our enslaved individuals. That is not smart if we are going to be successful enslavers. So this cuts down on the people who can, invest their time, energy, and lives into this fight. The Union had more manufacturing, more railroad track, and more financial resources. The South really only had one particular, like they had a few lines of railroad, but the big one in the Mississippi Valley, there was only one. So we're not looking at the ability to transport troops successfully very well. We are not looking at the ability to utilize these railroads in a way to help win the war. To end this not revolution, but that's what the South considered it. To end this situation, the Union has to invade and conquer the entire South. We also have to defeat a populace who is backing this war almost completely. You have to break the spirit, the civilization of the civilians in order to end this war. Once this war breaks out, There were a lot of people who wanted to be involved. There were tons of recruits that went to enlist, to the point where the Army really couldn't even support that many on both sides. The Union Army, they were seeing these unprecedented levels of enlistment, and Lincoln kept calling for more and more troops to use up these soldiers. They all thought that the war was going to be short. That didn't happen. I mean, 4 years is a long time. Both sides eventually resort to a draft. The Confederacy in 1862, the Union in 1863. By 1865, more than 2 million men served in the Union Army and 900,000 in the Confederate Army. The Northern Army was mostly made up of farm boys, shopkeepers, artisans, urban workers, and the South mostly consisted of non slaveholding small farmers. And then your slaveholding individuals that were involved were mostly your officers for the Confederacy. We can see here too this um, stratification of society is being reflected in the Army. Your slaveholding whites in the South are the ones who are your commanders. You're the ones that are controlling the situation, whereas your non-slaveholding individuals, or even few slaveholding individuals, are not so much in charge of what's going on. This is our map, obviously. By the time everyone had seceded, we have 11 slave states, and we still have that are in the Confederacy. I'm sorry, I didn't complete that thought. And we have five, I mean, no offense to the people from Delaware, but that's not such an important area. Maryland, West Virginia. Well, in West Virginia, too, can remember at the beginning of the war, it isn't a state. It doesn't exist. The reason why it becomes a state is because early on in the war, McClellan he's moving into Ohio to, do some military things. And in West Virginia, there's this pocket of people, of Unionists. And it's these Unionists that kind of secede from Virginia's secession. Like it's kind of convoluted there, but they form their own state because they're like, look, we don't want to leave the Union. Like we're not on board with the rest of Virginia. So that area actually maintains the area that makes it a state in 1863. There, I think I finished all the statements that I wanted to make there. Oh, also keep in mind here, I hope you can see that I'm moving my mouse here. I'm not sure if you can. This area right here, this area right here is where most of our battles are fought. Most of our battles are fought in this interior of Virginia. We also have some fighting up and down your Mississippi River. There is some fighting in here. But your major battles, the ones that everyone can name, they take place right here. And those are the ones that count. I mean, I don't know how to put that. They're the ones that are of import. All right, so these are carte vistes of Sergeant James W. Travis from the 38th Illinois and Private Edwin Francis Jemison from the 2nd Louisiana. Jemison was killed in battle at the Battle of Malvern Hill in July of 1862. Our technology. So our soldiers and our officers really did not anticipate our technological advances and how much they do change warfare. The Civil War is our first major war where the railroad moves our troops and our supplies. We have the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimac, which has our ironclads, which has to do with the ability to encase boats in metal. The telegraph, observation balloons, hand grenades, and submarines were used for the first time. Submarines were actually used first by the Confederacy. It's called the Hunley. And I always have been looking. I know I've watched a documentary on it before, and I've always looked for it to show the class, and I can never find this documentary on the Hunley. But it's really cool to me. Most of you would be like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. We have a revolution in arms manufacturing. We don't use our musket anymore. We now have our rifle, and remember, it has a grooved barrel, so this makes accuracy much better. We have our heavy fortifications and our trenches that are much more important. Now, it's not exactly trench warfare, but it is a new it's not so much marching at each other and firing anymore. We have many dead. We have weapons right now that can be used by one individual and more accurately and quickly kill multiple individuals. The most recent estimate of the amount of people who died in the Civil War was around 750,000. And to put that into perspective, that means that 7 million people today would die. And there are, I believe it's around 2 to 3 million people in Mississippi, like the entire amount. The death toll exceeds the total of all other wars in which Americans have died, from the Revolution to the War on Terror. We have very primitive medical care. We have prisoner of war camps that are, I can't even vocalize how bad prisoner of war camps are. Andersonville was hellacious. So here is an 8-inch cannon, and the cannon, okay, I don't know much about cannon, but I'm pretty sure that means that the cannonball's diameter was 8 inches. Don't quote me on that, though. All right, the public and the war. Our Civil War is really the first where propaganda comes into play. We have photography now, and we want to sway public opinion on whichever side we're on. We want to mobilize the public to support either our Union or support the Confederacy. The Democratic Party is shown as treasonous, and the South is accused of crimes against Union soldiers and civilians. And then the South just flips it around. So it's precisely what you would expect to come out of this. And the fact that now that we have photographs of the dead on the battlefield, it gives more of a visceral feeling to warfare. These are people that we know. These are people, this could have been, my son, maybe it is my son. And so this is really impactful on the way war is fought, especially with the public. Neither side was really prepared for this war. There's no national banking system. There's no tax system to raise our revenues in order to fight this war. You have to have money to fight a war. Even to the point where there aren't that many accurate maps of the South. It's like someone was like, yeah, we'll get to that later. Lincoln is urged by Winfield Scott to do what is called the Anaconda Plan. And this Anaconda Plan entails blockading Southern troops, Southern ports, to make sure that they cannot get foreign aid. It also calls for capturing the Mississippi River in order to kind of cut the Confederacy in half, and then slowly squeeze out your Confederacy, starve them for, all intents and purposes. The problem with this is that it's slow, and time gives your enemy the ability to regroup, to plan, and to do a better job of what they're trying to do. Initially, the Navy doesn't have enough ships to actually successfully blockade the South. Um, we have logistical problems. So the fact that we have to purchase this like food, have we have to distribute it, and we have to have supplies. I mean, if you do not have a logistic system in place, then you should not even be fighting this war, because that is what wins your war, is your successful logistics. The Union Army eventually becomes the best fed and best supplied force in history. And the Southern soldiers were basically working with nothing, whatever they could beg, borrow, and steal. Here we have a nice little graph that shows you your blue is your Union advantages, and then your white is the Confederate advantages. So I think we can see here in color coding precisely who has the advantage on paper. Now, keep in mind that yes, the Union has more soldiers, it has more population, but unless you can get those soldiers to the place of battle, it doesn't really matter. If you do not have all of your forces engaged in battle with all of the other side's forces, who cares? It's the same. You're roughly going to have the same number of men in a battalion, roughly the same number of men in each unit. So this is one of the things that the Union is not really able to capitalize on as successfully as it looks like they should be able to. And I mean, if you keep in mind in the Revolution, I mean, the Patriots did not seem like they were supposed to win, and there they went and won. The Confederacy is hamstrung by the very thing that it purports to be in favor of. There's too much power left in the hands of the state governors, and Jefferson Davis is not given as much leeway and lack of oversight to do what is necessary. They do not have a strong executive, and because of this, Jefferson Davis is really limited in what he's able to do. This is a painting, The War Spirit at Home. It's by a New Jersey artist, and it depicts a family reading of the capture of Vicksburg in 1863. And you notice in there are only women and children. The husband could be in the army, maybe he's dead. They play as soldiers, the kids do, and however, if we look at here, there's a very obvious cross. So maybe our woman, maybe she's reading of the death of her husband. Maybe she's reading of the death of her brother. This is to reflect how very common it was to lose people, and to see that it is our newspapers at this point that is bringing this news home. All right, military strategies. The South adopts a defensive strategy. Initially, they've got two options. Do they want to just kind of stay in their own lane and defend as necessary, or do they want to try to invade the North? They do not have the ability to invade. They start to make, I mean, they do have some incursions here and there, but they just don't have the manpower. The South wants to wear down the North, and the North wants to kind of do the same thing. They want to fight a war of exhaustion, so exhaust the South and its resources. And they want to have a war of annihilation, completely destroy it. This is where we have our civilians. You target the civilians, you make it so that they no longer want to support the war effort. Lee wants to wear down Northern Resolve as well. They don't necessarily want to gain any more land than they have with your states in rebellion, but they do just want to be recognized as, okay, they left, they're their own thing now. Lincoln understands that capturing and occupying territory is not going to win our war. You have to 100% defeat the South and its armies. If you cannot take the fight out of them, you are not going to win that war. When he, again, remember that Lincoln does not start the war with the idea of emancipation. He wants to limit slavery to where it already was. Granted, when we go to war, I'm sure his thoughts are starting to move in that direction. And eventually he says, look, they're not going to come back and be the same. We're not going to let them come back with slavery. This was our issue, so let's get rid of that issue. Eventually, slavery, I mean, it's shown, what's his name? Alexander Stephens makes the cornerstone speech. And in that speech, he talks about how slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederate way of life. And so if we move that cornerstone, we have no more Confederacy. They make this a military target. Most of our war happens on a narrow strip of land between Washington and Richmond. And we have a series of generals appointed by Lincoln. He's trying to find the best fit. We have one after the other after the other. Our first battle is the Battle of Bull Run, and it is, I believe, I don't have my notes in front of me, but I'm pretty sure the commander for the Union was a man named Howe or Howell. I wish I had brought those notes with me, but I am in Miss Brock's office because I currently do not have my own place to record right now, so that's okay. Our first, like I said, our first significant battle is at Bull Run, and it is, if you look at a map, I believe we have a map coming up. It is very, very close to Washington, D.C. Keep in mind that our Southerners name their battles after geographic features, and our Northerners name their battles after the closest city. It's kind of interesting because, you can see what each side is concerned with. So First Manassas is the same as First Bull Run. No one ever taught me that. Like, literally, no one ever taught me that. Of course, I have to admit, my education on the Civil War is not that great. But no one ever taught me that. And then finally, when I learned this fact, I was like, oh, God, that makes so much more sense now. Yeah, it really does. After the Union almost wins Bull Run, almost. But Stonewall Jackson is crazy, and he happens to be a commander there, and he is helping, we have our commanders Beauregard and Johnston. Johnston is bringing in reinforcements, and Stonewall Jackson inspires the men long enough to hold their position for Johnston's men to come in by railroad. This is when he gets his nickname Stonewall, because Jackson was standing there like a stone wall. Crazy man. Crazy, crazy. I love him for how insane he was, but I hate him for everything else. After this battle, Lincoln's like, all right, man, you're gone. Yeah, we don't need you. He appoints George McClellan. He ends up taking command of the Army of the Potomac. That is what the main Union army is called. I did say Army of the Potomac, right? I hope I did. Because General Lee's army is known as the Army of Northern Virginia. Of course it is. George McClellan recruits well, he trains well, he drills well. He doesn't want to actually let them fight. He was a Democrat. That may have had something to do with it. It may have had to do with the fact that he was not necessarily opposed to slavery. He wasn't like all about, let's not do that. He just wanted to end the conflict. So, understandable. It's very easy for someone who has never had to send people into battle to do that. If you've never seen someone die because you made them do it, yeah, I think that is easy to send someone to do. But I don't know. Maybe McClellan was a little bit deeper than history tends to give him credit for. All right, our theaters. So we have, let's see, McClellan actually leads his Army of the Potomac in spring of 1862 into Virginia. This is called the Peninsula Campaign. He is on a peninsula south of Richmond. Lee has no problems deflecting this. This makes McClellan retreat back to D.C. The Confederate Army came very, very close to invading the capital. They didn't, but they almost did. Although, almost doesn't count. Lee wins the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas. He begins to take his army into the north. Fortunately, they were stopped. The Home Guard, I don't think it's not called the Home Guard, but troops, Massachusetts sends out their troops, and then troops within, like, the people that are defending D.C., they kind of come through too, to keep the Confederates from invading the capital. Our war in the East, like I was saying before, this is where most of our important fighting happens. There is the war in the West, and keep in mind that our West at this point is considered roughly like Tennessee. Mississippi is considered part of the West. You have the Trans-Mississippi Theater, and it's not like it, I'm sure it was very important for the people who fought in it and who were there, but it's not important for our purposes. Then you also have our water. So the sea is also considered the theater of battle. So Battle of Antietam happens. It is the single bloodiest day of any war up to that point for Americans. 4,000 men were killed, 18,000 were wounded. This battle happened on September 17th, 1862. And more men, what does it say? It says more men, I'm reading this, died in this battle than any other day in American history, including Pearl Harbor and D-Day in World War II and the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. So not like over the entire war, but single day of battle, more people died in that. We're having some early successes. Oh, and eventually, technically the Union won Antietam, but not really. They did, but at what cost? We lost a lot of people. The North is doing better in the West because of old Mr. Ulysses S. Grant, and the S in his name stands for nothing. That's that. No, he just kind of added it when he went to West Point. He was not very successful in anything he did. He graduated at the bottom of his class from West Point. He was a very good husband. So there is that. Julia Grant was a very pleased woman. He treated her very well. She was from a slaveholding family, and by all accounts, they were very, very much in love their whole life. I meant to look this up. I think Grant apprenticed as a saddle maker. I do not know why that is stuck in my head. I said it in the class along with, I don't know why I'm thinking that, but I think he was apprenticed as a saddle maker. He didn't do well in that. He tried to be a farmer, didn't do well in that because he was opposed to slavery. So, it's when they were in Missouri. He was living in Missouri with his family. And so his, father-in-law was like, why don't you have slaves for this land that I gave you, that you're farming, that you're not doing a good job at? And he was like, no, I don't believe in that. He is a very good military man. He's not good at civilians. He is, I'll say decisive. Decisive in relation to some people. He understands that you cannot be honorable in warfare. There's not a way to do it. You don't let your enemy retreat. You follow them. Do not let them regroup. He gets Fort Donelson in Tennessee. Then he leads the Union to a victory in Corinth. The Battle of, oh my God. Yeah, I guess that's the Battle of Corinth. Battle of Shiloh. Is it Shiloh? I'm sorry, my attention is being distracted right now because Miss King is speaking really loud to her class, and so like I'm for some reason my brain is like, ooh, I'm going to listen to that a little bit, and I don't need to listen to that. I need to remember like what I'm talking about. Um, our naval forces under Admiral David G. Farragut, he takes New Orleans. I mean, like they capture that city, and so now he is in control of the largest city in the South. He's in control of the Mississippi River and all of those sugar plantations that are in Louisiana. It is Shiloh. I'm right. Did I say Shiloh? Now I can't remember what I said. Oh well, doesn't matter. Shiloh. Ha. The Confederates decided they wanted to attack there, and they lost big time. So good job there, guys. Hold on. I think what am I doing? I don't know. There we go. All right. So yeah, this is our Civil War in the East. So if you look here, DC is here. This is where McClellan mustered his men. This right here is what's considered the Peninsula Campaign. Tries to go there, doesn't do well. And then we have Antietam. We have, and this right here is, where is it? Battle of Bull Run, first and second, right here, Manassas. See, yeah. And Fredericksburg is also a pretty big battle that a lot of people die in. This right here is the departure of the 7th Regiment. It's a lithograph. It illustrates the departure of a unit of the New York State Militia. A contemporary writer wrote, New York was certainly raving mad with excitement. The ladies laughed, smiled, sighed, sobbed, and wept. The men cheered and shouted as never men cheered and shouted before. This shows we have support for our war. At the beginning, we have huge amounts of support. People want to fight this war on both sides, really. So our next focus question is, how did a war to preserve the Union become a war to end slavery? Okay. Obviously, our Civil War greatly impacts the institution of slavery and how that is enmeshed in American society. The emancipation of America's enslaved people is greater than any other emancipation of enslaved people or the serfs in Russia. So hopefully you learned about serfs, S-E-R-F-S, not smurfs, not surf as in like a wave, like serfs as in tied to the land. If you don't know what that is, it's not important for our class, but you may just want to know what that is, like in general. At first, Lincoln is insistent that slavery is irrelevant to our war. We want to keep our border states in the Union, and we are mad because these people thought they had the ability to secede. So, and of course, I mean, if he outlawed slavery, your border states most likely were not going to stay in the Union. He uses I guess I would say he uses kind of like an iron fist with the state of Maryland. There's martial law in the state of Maryland during the war. This is where Lincoln famously suspends the right of habeas corpus, and it makes sense that he did this because of how close Maryland is to Washington, D.C. Now, in Kentucky, he uses kid gloves. Kentucky initially says, look, we're neutral. We don't want to get involved in this conflict. And the first side to violate that was the Confederacy. Some troops from Tennessee invaded, and so Kentucky got mad. And they were like, look, we said we were neutral. Don't you dare try to invade us. We are moving with the Union. It's pretty funny. The Crittenden resolution from a congressman in, again, Kentucky. This was passed early on in the war, and it affirms that the Union does not intend to interfere with slavery. Um, Northern commanders initially return fugitive slaves, and your abolitionists in the North are like, well, "What are you doing? This is the whole point of this," even though technically it wasn't. When it becomes clear that the Confederacy is more than willing to take their slaves to do the grunt work of battle, now there were not armed enslaved people fighting for the Confederacy. I have an entire book about it. This historian did work on. I've got more than one book, honestly. There weren't enslaved people fighting for the South. They were, though, taken as camp followers and servants at camp. So, and again, this isn't to say, too, that like somebody, and some enslaved man didn't pick up a, rifle and shoot it to protect himself. That's not necessarily what it means. But it does mean that like they did not have enlisted soldiers that were recognized as such by the Confederacy. In 1861, the military adopts a policy to treat escaped slaves as contraband of war. And this means that it is property of the military, it has value to the military, therefore they are going to use it for the warfare. He calls these enslaved individuals contraband and starts contraband camps, contraband schools. But if you remember one of the reading that we read about to lose Kentucky is to lose the whole game, he goes, we can't do this because number one, that completely defeats our argument on whether or not our group is, whether or not these people are considered people. If it's contraband, then they are items. If they are, and we want to say they are people. Our enslaved individuals were doing their best to, the people formerly enslaved in the North were trying to convince the people that were reluctant for abolition to emancipate. Black people in the North and South were calling the conflict a freedom war. And in 61 and 62, the Union is starting to occupy Confederate territory. Thousands of enslaved people go to northern lines. And we're starting, instead of it just being mostly men, as it was like at the beginning, like before the war, it's a lot of women and children. Entire families are leaving. They pass along military intelligence. They also have knowledge of the southern terrain. So remember, we didn't have very many maps of our Confederacy. Well, now that we have these enslaved individuals who have escaped over this terrain, perhaps they do. In Louisiana, once the Union troops get there, our enslaved people start to basically destroy plantations. They refuse to work without wages. They're doing more than what they should do or what they should have to do in order to convince people that they deserve to be freed. This is our Western theater, as you can see right here, Shiloh, and that's Corinth up there. That's what it was. They're the same thing, the Battle of Corinth and the Battle of Shiloh. Fort Donaldson. Did I say Fort Donaldson or did I say Fort McHenry? McHenry's in the War of 1812. I'm sorry if I said that. I meant Fort Henry and Fort Donaldson. But these are Grant victories. And then down here, Farragut at New Orleans. Let's see. We have this is a photograph of people that would eventually be called contrabands. That's what escaped, formerly enslaved people were called when they would make it to a Union camp. All right. With the exception, hold on, I'm sorry, let me back up a little bit. Abolitionists and what are known and come to be known as radical Republicans want abolition to be a war goal. Congress, not so sure that this is working, and so they prohibit the Army from returning fugitive slaves. They're like, we're going to take this away from them too. They abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. Hmm, interesting. And the Second Confiscation Act freed slaves that were disloyal. I'm sorry. They freed enslaved individuals of disloyal owners in Union occupied territory. Hopefully that makes sense. So if your enslaver was not loyal to the Union and the Union occupied where you were, then you were free at that point. This is the Second Confiscation Act. Um, Fremont, who is also kind of known for California, he is a commander in Missouri. This is where a nasty guerrilla war happens throughout the entire war. It's almost like Missouri was its own civil war within a civil war. Fremont gives this overarching order to free all enslaved people, and Lincoln is like, nope. We cannot do that. He rescinds the order because he's afraid that our border states are going to panic and secede and join the Confederacy. Lincoln starts to urge our border states, hey, how about we start to adopt some gradual emancipation policies? We can pay you for the loss of your property. Like, we understand that this might be some of the problem about why you don't necessarily want to get rid of slavery. It is a large financial loss. So how about the Union compensate you for your financial losses? He's also still big into this Liberia plan, like colonization. In 1862, he meets with some black leaders, and he's like, hey, why don't you move out of the United States? He signs an agreement with some entrepreneur to settle formerly enslaved people on an island off the coast of Haiti, which I don't even know how to approach that one. But by 62, by the summer of that year, Lincoln is like, look, emancipation, we're making it a military issue, and it is a political necessity because we don't want Britain to side with the Confederacy. Like, as long as the Union is like, you know what, we are doing this on moral grounds, we are going to outlaw slavery, Britain could not then go, well, we support that. We support slavery because, most of the quote unquote civilized world is against formal slavery. That does not necessarily mean that there are not people kept in conditions that could be likened to slavery, but formally they want to not have that PR in their hands. Lincoln does not want to emancipate enslaved people in the Union until there is a victory. There's no sense in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I believe. I guess that's what he was thinking. Once the Battle of Antietam happens, there is a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Our Democrats in the North kind of capitalize on this, and they're like, they're going to take all your slaves. But Lincoln says, look, in giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. So he goes, freedom for these people means freedom for you too. As long as we're preserving freedom, it benefits both parties. This right here is our Emancipation Proclamation area. So our green, as you can see, is a free state. Our pink is a slave state in the Union where the proclamation does not apply. So keep in mind that our Emancipation Proclamation had to do with states currently in rebellion. So that doesn't mean Missouri or Kentucky or West Virginia or Maryland or Delaware. Slaves are still enslaved in these areas. Our brown is free territory, even though there are some battles that happen in New Mexico. I learned that last year, and I was shocked. Confederate areas occupied by the Union are these up and down parallel lines. Areas to where the Emancipation Proclamation applies are these crosshatches. So, yeah. And right here is where our Union already has, they've already taken that area, and so enslaved people were immediately freed there. This is an engraving from the British magazine Punch from October of 1862. It shows it's basically like, hey, look, here's a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and he's saying, and they're obviously they're indicating that this was his last card. This is the only thing he had left to play. And he's getting desperate because I believe this looks like a desperate Lincoln, and they're playing on a barrel of gunpowder. That can't be safe. I like his Wolverine hair. That's nice. Before Wolverine was even a thing. Okay. January 1st of 1863, Lincoln signs our Emancipation Proclamation. The document does not free all slaves. I cannot repeat that enough. So as Lincoln relies back on his authority as a commander-in-chief. The proclamation exempts areas under Union control, so it does not apply to loyal border states that had not seceded. It does not apply to the Confederacy occupied by Union forces. So that means, like, if we go back here, so this area, Tennessee, this little part of Virginia right here, and southern Louisiana, not Emancipation Proclamation areas. It does free the vast majority of the South's enslaved people. That's more than 3 million men, women, and children. However, you got to wait till your Union Army gets there, because it's most, I mean, I would hazard a guess and say that no enslavers actually looked at their enslaved people and went, oh, yes, this country that we have seceded from says that you're all free now, so I guess we have to follow that. Go ahead and skedaddle on out of here. It took the Union Army moving south to put emancipation into place. We have jubilation. It alters. We have jubilation amongst abolitionists, amongst the formerly enslaved, amongst free black people. This obviously changes the course of American history. It alters the nature of the Civil War. One of the problems I would like to point out with this, though, I can't remember if this is actually in your book, the Emancipation Proclamation does not put in place any kind of strategy or infrastructure to take care of these newly freed people. These are people who had overwhelmingly no education. They overwhelmingly had few job skills. Depending on the enslaver, these people were, treated like children. And so just simply saying, all right, you're free, I wonder how beneficial that was for everyday life. Obviously, yes, we want freedom. No one deserves to be enslaved. No one should be enslaved. But when we're talking about day-to-day life, I am not really sure how much this Emancipation Proclamation would have helped your everyday enslaved individual without infrastructure on how to now start your life. But I will say that this emancipation order allowed the North to start enlisting black soldiers in the Union Army. Your first all-black division was the Massachusetts 54th. It very famously is profiled in the movie Glory. It was led by a white commander, and eventually, most of this division is either their casualties at a war, and I believe it's South Carolina, and the white officer in charge of them is also killed, and the Confederates, thinking that it was an insult, buried him in a mass grave with the black individuals who died fighting for the Union as well. And when the war was over, some people asked, his family, they said, do you want us to go and, find his body for burial? And they said, no, the biggest honor that he can have is being buried amongst his men. So that always gives me chills because, oh my goodness. Okay. Emancipation was immediate. We have no compensation for your enslavers. So see, if they had just done what Lincoln wanted to do in the first place, they could have at least made some money back on it. Like, they could have made some. It wasn't like full compensation. It was, I can't remember what the percentage was, and I'm not going to look it up right now. But instead, we just get this total emancipation, which I think is, karma right there. You have enslaved people for hundreds of years, and you're offered a way to perhaps make this easier, and you dig your heels in, and they're like, fine, we're not going to give you nothing. In 1888, Brazil finally abolishes slavery, and that is when slavery is completely gone in the Western Hemisphere legally. I'll always put legally there because, as I said, there are people that live in conditions that are like slavery. They're just not legally recognized as such. Lincoln shows us how good, I'm going to say how good of a person he is, how he can, over time, his views evolved. They changed. He was open to new information. He was open to being flexible. And in my personal opinion, being open to information you may not necessarily agree with or may not necessarily jive with your worldview, but being willing to hear it and being willing to consider it as maybe something better than that shows a brilliant person, because it's very easy to fall back on things that you believe. It's not easy to listen to the other side and maturely understand what's going on and then be willing to admit that you were wrong and that you should change what you thought. Our cancel culture right now, here I'm going to get on a soapbox. Cancel culture now is too willing to vilify people for something they've done in the past. And simply because someone did something in the past does not necessarily mean that they have retained the views that supported, problematic behavior. So, I mean, I do think that there is no room in, life. I mean, not like life in general, but like life, like public life, for people who have abhorrent views. But I also think that not educating them and not allowing them to be like, oh, my bad, and move on from that, I think that's just as bad as keeping, your horrendous views. But that's neither here nor there. This is a engraving, I believe, of emancipation of formerly enslaved, celebrating. It was published in Le Monde Illustré, so French periodical. All right, so I forgot to include this about the Navy, and I'm glad that now I have a slide to do that. So in the Army, we still have very segregated divisions. Black men and white men are not allowed to serve together. Black men are paid less than white men. But the Navy has, it allows black individuals to serve as sailors. Not so much segregation here because when you're on a boat, like you can't really segregate. It's very difficult. Lincoln initially didn't want to allow black men to serve, thinking it would alienate white soldiers and border slave states because, like you see, you're giving these formerly enslaved people guns and then they're marching through. They're like, oh, this is going to cause a problem. But they show I can't say this word. They show heroic acts, there we go, in battle. Fort Wagner, South Carolina. That's the stupid battle that I was thinking of. Oh, I had it right. Most of these soldiers were emancipated, formerly enslaved people who joined the army in the South. There were a lot of slaves from our loyal border states that were excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation. And for most of the war in this area, this was the only way they could become free. So, you enlist and you gain your freedom that way. Military service is liberating for many of these formerly enslaved people. A lot of these soldiers who, fight in the war and then become famous for their heroism. I think that's the word. It makes me think of heroin though, so I'm thinking maybe I'm wrong. They end up becoming like political leaders in the Reconstruction. But we have a few monuments that actually commemorate their service. That's kind of sad. We have statues to white military people, not very many black military people. But it is a matter of pride for many of these men and for many of their families who are able to point and show, like, look, we're doing more than our part, honestly, because you should have done this a long time ago. They weren't allowed, black individuals were not allowed to rise to officer ranks. And we have the Fort Pillow Massacre. In class, we did not have the time to read it, but I do have it posted, and it's Nathan Bedford Forrest was the Southern commander there, and he ends up founding the KKK. So delightful. Many of his troops killed black soldiers who had surrendered. So there we are. Many Republicans thought that emancipation meant equal protection of the law regardless of race. Really, though, this doesn't go into effect until we actually have this constitutional amendment. I mean, like, yeah, maybe in some places, but no. Okay, that's all I'm going to say on that one. This is a photograph, obviously, of a black woman. You can see how patriotic she is. She has this flag tucked into her dress, in the bodice of her dress. Maybe this may have been the only photograph she ever posed for, and she's so proud of her country for finally stepping up and showing the humanity of herself and her fellow citizens who had been enslaved. And I love this sweet little picture. It is the only known picture of a black Union soldier with his family. And so it's our soldier here, his wife, dressed all nicely. I love her bonnet. And you have the two little girls in their nice little bonnets. So point of pride serving in the military for the formerly enslaved and even, your free black people from the North. So I believe, yes. So this is the end, finally, of this lecture. And I don't know what to say here. So, I like hedgehogs. I don't know. I really don't know what to say here. Go listen to, Weezer. They're a great band.